This story is a fictional work created solely for entertainment purposes. All names, characters, and events are invented. It does not depict real people or any official military actions. I was standing on the stage at Fort Benning with my right hand still tingling from the oath I had just taken when my stepdad Richard Hale decided to destroy the moment in the loudest way possible. The commissioning hall was packed with families, officers, and a handful of JAG personnel who were assisting with administrative checks for the new second lieutenants. The air smelled like polished floors, fresh uniforms, and pride. My name had just been called. Harper Lawson, United States Army officer, 27 years old, a girl who once scrubbed floors in a house where she never felt seen, now standing in a place built for people who had fought their way through every test thrown at them. I should have felt victorious, but then I heard his voice. Richard did not simply speak. He launched his words like he wanted them to hit me in the chest. "That is a joke," he shouted. "My daughter deserves that commission, not her." My stepsister Brielle rose from her seat beside him, eyes full of triumph, as if she had been waiting for this spotlight. She was in her ROTC uniform, and she adjusted her collar dramatically before calling out across the hall. "Everyone here should know I am the real officer." A murmur rippled through the auditorium. Chairs shifted, heads turned. An older woman near the aisle gasped softly. A colonel raised his brow. Someone from the back whispered, "Is he serious?" I felt my spine stiffen. My hands went cold. This was supposed to be the moment my life changed, but instead, it felt like being dragged back into the same living room where Richard used to tell me I would never amount to anything. For a second, my vision blurred, as if humiliation was trying to force tears out of me, but I did not let it. I had survived worse than this. I locked my knees straighter, lifted my chin, and stared directly at Richard. He kept going louder this time. "She is nothing but a charity case I paid for everything she has. Brielle deserves that rank, not her." The auditorium became painfully silent. Even the air seemed to pause. Then I heard the measured steps of Captain William Torres from the Judge Advocate General Corps. I had noticed him earlier, but I thought he was only doing routine checks. Now he was walking directly toward me, eyes sharp, jaw set. He stopped at my shoulder, his voice low but heavy enough that Richard heard it too. "Lieutenant Lawson, I need you to follow me for a moment." Richard laughed loudly. "See? Even they know something is wrong." For the first time since he began shouting, I spoke. My voice came out steady, calm, almost quiet, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "Richard, you have no idea how badly this is going to turn back on you." He opened his mouth, but before he could fire another insult, Captain Torres stepped between us. "Sir, please refrain from further disruption. This ceremony is not the place for personal attacks." Several people in the audience nodded. A few even whispered good. Torres guided me down the stage steps into a small administrative room behind the curtains. My heart was pounding, but not from embarrassment, from anticipation, because I knew what was coming. I reached into my bag and pulled out a black folder thick with documents gathered over years of silent endurance. Torres saw the corner of the papers and his eyes changed. "What is that?" he asked. "Proof," I said. "Proof he never expected me to bring today." And with that, the life I thought I understood was about to split open. I was 11 years old when my mother remarried and moved us from a modest apartment in Chattanooga to the Hale House in Knoxville, Tennessee. At that age, I did not have the words to describe the feeling that settled in my stomach during the drive. I only knew something was ending and something else was starting, and neither of them felt like they belonged to me. The Hale house was twice the size of anything I had ever lived in, with a long driveway trimmed with azaleas and a porch that wrapped around the front like it was trying to impress strangers. Richard Hale stood waiting at the door with his daughter Brielle, who was 9 at the time, but already carried herself like she expected the world to rearrange around her. She had soft blonde curls, a pink dress with lace edging, and a wide smile that did not reach her eyes. My mother kept squeezing my shoulder as if she sensed the dread I could not put into sentences. Inside the house, everything smelled new and polished, with framed photos of Richard and Brielle filling the hallway from floor to ceiling. Father-daughter fishing trips, dance recitals, school awards. Not a single spot left open for anyone else. Richard clasped my mother's waist in a way that looked rehearsed, then glanced at me with a flat grin. "Harper, why don't you go upstairs and take a look around? Brielle will show you where you will be staying." Brielle stepped forward, but her tone was already possessive. "Your room is the smaller one at the end of the hall. Dad said it makes sense because I need more space for my dance equipment." I nodded, even though something inside me tightened. The smaller room looked like an afterthought. Faded walls, a window that stuck when I tried to open it, and a thin mattress that sagged in the middle. Down the hall, I could hear Brielle showing my mother her room, which was decorated with fresh paint, a canopy bed, and rows of trophies displayed like precious gems. The message settled in before the first night ended. This was not my home. I was simply being added to their existing picture, like a corner sticker someone forgot to peel off. It did not take long for that unspoken message to sharpen into daily routine. The morning after we moved in, my mother left early for work and Richard knocked on my door without waiting for an answer. "I need you to help keep the place tidy," he said. "Brielle has a full schedule, so she cannot waste time on chores." Full schedule meant dance classes, piano lessons, and extended afternoons at the neighborhood pool. Meanwhile, I was assigned dishwashing, vacuuming, and folding laundry for a household I had barely lived in. When I protested quietly one afternoon, Richard looked down at me with a smile far colder than his voice. "You should be grateful. Not many men would take in someone else's kid." The next weeks shaped themselves into a rhythm I felt trapped inside. At school, Brielle bragged about the vacations they were planning. "Dad says we might go to Destin this summer, maybe Vail for winter." "You probably cannot come," she would add sweetly before glancing at my clothes or my shoes. They were never the brand she or her friends wore. Holidays made that divide feel even sharper. Christmas morning, Brielle would tear into glossy packages stacked like a small tower. Tablets, designer shoes, new coats with tags still attached. I would unwrap a single sweater or a journal, and Richard would pat my back with a pretend sympathy that stung more than anything he said. "We cannot spoil everyone," he would remark. "Your mother understands." But it was not the gifts that hurt the most. It was the tone, the constant comparison, the never-ending reminder that Brielle was the star and I was the shadow beside her. One memory still stands out like a bruise from those early years. I had stayed up late for weeks working on a drawing of the Hale house, hoping it would make Richard see me differently even for a moment. When I handed it to him, he studied it for a second, then nodded toward Brielle. "Maybe she can teach you how to make it look better. She has real talent." Brielle giggled behind her hand. "Yeah? Harper, it looks kind of crooked." I tried to laugh with her, tried to pretend I did not feel small, but something inside me folded in on itself quietly. That became my survival strategy. Staying quiet. Staying small. Taking up as little space as possible so I would not be noticed except when something needed to be done. My mother saw pieces of it unfolding, but she was caught between keeping peace and keeping stability. She worked long shifts, and when she came home, she tried to smooth everything over with soft voices and soft touches. She did not see the full picture. She did not see the way Richard's praise poured endlessly into Brielle while he rationed approval for me like it cost him something personal. When I turned 13, he told me in front of the dinner table, "You should learn from Brielle. That girl is going places. Not everyone can be special." Brielle smiled around a fork full of mashed potatoes. I felt something in my chest harden. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet resignation that this was the role I had been assigned in this house. Invisible, replaceable, expected to endure. The years that followed did not get easier. They only taught me how to disappear inside myself. I became the girl who blended into corners, who finished chores before anyone noticed, and who learned to expect nothing, so disappointment did not sting as much. But that silence, the quiet shape my life took in those years, would eventually become my greatest strength, even though I did not know it yet. Because when people underestimate you long enough, they forget you are watching everything, learning everything, and preparing for the exact moment when their favoritism and cruelty finally stop being your burden. Did you grow up in a family where one child was the favorite and another was invisible? Tell me where you are watching from. By the time I was 14, Richard's influence over our household had shifted from irritating to absolute. It happened quietly at first, through small decisions that my mother allowed because she believed keeping the peace was easier than confronting him. He took over the budgeting, then the bill paying, then the savings accounts. Soon, even the grocery money passed through his hands before it reached our kitchen table. My mother never admitted she felt trapped, but I could see it in the way she hesitated before asking him for anything. Her shoulders would lift slightly, her voice softening as if she were asking permission instead of partnership. I noticed those details because I was already learning how power worked in that house. Richard controlled it with a smile. When he wanted Brielle to have something, he found a way to afford it. New uniforms, new dance shoes, weekend trips, and private lessons. When I asked to join a school club, he frowned as if I had suggested something wasteful. Those activities are expensive. Harper, and frankly, you should focus on being useful around here. Being useful meant dishes vacuuming, ironing, and ironing again when he decided the first attempt was not crisp enough. It meant keeping the lawn tidy even when Brielle sat outside with friends sipping iced drinks while I pushed the mower under the summer sun. It meant knowing the rhythm of the household and staying a step ahead so he would not find a reason to scold me in front of my mother. At first, I thought he simply preferred order, but I soon realized he preferred control. He wanted every schedule in the house to revolve around his needs and every accomplishment to reflect well on him. Brielle fit that mold easily. She excelled in dance and academics, and he praised her loudly. "Look at that form. Look how disciplined she is. This girl has a future." When I got good grades, he skimmed over my report card while reaching for the mail. "Grades are the bare minimum if you want to be respected," he would say. There was no winning. If I succeeded, it was expected. If I struggled, it was evidence of a flaw he claimed he had always seen. The imbalance grew more obvious each year. Brielle once bragged that her father had promised her a car when she turned 16. When she said it, she watched me for a reaction, as if waiting for jealousy to crawl across my face. I only shrugged. I already knew whatever I hoped for would not be offered to me. The moment that solidified this truth arrived in the spring of my sophomore year of high school. I had spent months preparing for an academic scholarship offered by a local foundation. Long nights studying extra coursework, drafting essays, and asking teachers for feedback. It was the first time I allowed myself to imagine something beyond the Hale house. A way out. A way forward. The day the letter arrived, I recognized the envelope instantly. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my fingertips. I waited until after school to open it, wanting a quiet moment to take in the news. "Harper," it began. "We are pleased to inform you." I did not read the rest before covering my mouth with both hands. I had done it. I had earned my escape. I tucked the letter back inside its envelope and planned to show my mother after dinner. When I entered the kitchen, Richard was sitting at the table sorting the mail. I froze. The scholarship envelope was in his hand. I opened my mouth to speak, but his eyes moved across the text, and something twisted in his expression. "Harper. Huh. So they think you deserve this." His tone made the words sound like an insult. I stepped forward slowly. "That is my letter." He lifted it higher, studying it like it offended him. Then, without warning, he tore it straight down the center. I felt the sound before I processed what he had done. The ripping shuddered through the air like something being broken inside me. I lunged forward, but he held the halves out of reach. "You think this happened because of you?" he said. "Everything you have comes from me. I feed you, I give you a roof. If anyone deserves recognition, it is me, not some child who has no idea how the real world works." My voice cracked as I whispered, "Please stop." My mother walked in just then, her face paling as she took in the scene, but Richard shook his head and handed her the torn pages. She should focus on chores and responsibility, not some fantasy about leaving this house. She has duties here. Duties. That word clung to me for years. My mother tried to tape the letter back together that night, but the gesture only made the loss feel heavier. She whispered that she was sorry that he had been under stress, that things would be different soon, but I understood something she did not want to face. Things would not be different. Things would not get better. Richard had no intention of letting me grow beyond the role he assigned me. That night, lying awake in the too small room they called mine, I stared at the ceiling and made a decision I did not say out loud. One day I would leave their house and never return. One day their control over me would end. One day I would earn a life that had nothing to do with Richard Hale's name or his cruelty. I did not know how or when, but I knew I would not be a silent shadow forever. The fire that would eventually carry me all the way to Fort Benning began in that moment as quietly as a breath and as fiercely as survival. By the time I graduated from Tennessee State University at 22, the promise I had made to myself years earlier had hardened into something unshakable. I knew I needed a path that did not depend on Richard's approval or his money or his twisted belief that he owned every step of my future. The Army had always been a distant thought in the back of my mind, something I associated with discipline structure and a level of fairness I had never experienced at home. The more I researched, the more it felt like the only doorway not locked by Richard's influence. When I told my mother I was applying to officer candidate school, she hugged me tightly, though I could see fear flicker behind her smile. When I told Richard, he laughed. The sound was sharp and familiar, like the crack of the scholarship letter he once tore in half. "The Army does not need someone like you," he said, leaning back in his chair as though my life were a joke he had already grown bored of. "They need leaders, not fragile little girls who run away when things get hard." I held his gaze for the first time in years. "I am not running," I said. "I am choosing something better." He scoffed and waved me off, but something in his jaw tightened. He knew I was slipping beyond his control, and nothing unsettled him more. My acceptance into OCS arrived 3 months later. Unlike the scholarship letter this one, I did not open in the kitchen. I drove to a nearby park, sat under a sycamore tree, and let the words wash over me. Officer Candidate School. Report date, Fort Benning, Georgia. The next morning I packed my bags while Richard stood in the doorway with a smirk. "When you fail, do not expect to come back here." I zipped the final pocket on my duffel and answered quietly, "I am not planning to come back anyway." Fort Benning was nothing like Knoxville. The air was thicker, the pace faster, and every face around me seemed carved from a different kind of determination. The first day of OCS stripped away any illusion I had about what the Army expected. It was not enough to be smart or strong or disciplined. You had to be all three at once and willing to push past every point where your mind begged you to stop. That was exactly what I needed. In our first formation, I stood among dozens of candidates from every corner of the country. A drill sergeant paced the line, his boots hitting the pavement like a ticking clock. He demanded precision in everything: how we stood, how we breathed, how we spoke. I had spent years being told I would never measure up, so being held to a standard, spelled out in clear terms, felt oddly liberating. I could meet expectations when expectations were fair. The early weeks were a storm of physical training field exercises, leadership evaluations, and endless inspections. I struggled with land navigation at first, panicking when I could not find my points quickly enough. My rucksack felt heavier than everyone else's, and my legs burned during ruck marches, but I refused to fall behind. Every time doubt crept in, I heard Richard's voice saying the Army does not need someone like you. Those words became fuel. During leadership reaction courses, I learned how to command small teams through challenges designed to test cooperation and critical thinking. Some candidates barked orders, others froze under pressure. I found myself doing something I never expected. I listened. I assessed. I delegated with calm, even when my heart raced. For the first time in my life, people responded to me not because they were forced to, but because they trusted the way I processed problems. One evening after a long field exercise, our platoon TAC officer pulled me aside. "Lawson," he said, "you are quiet, but you think before you act. That is the mark of a leader." I had never been called a leader before. The word felt fragile and powerful all at once. As the course progressed, the challenges intensified. We learned tactical planning, convoy operations, and ethical decision-making. My uniform became stained with Georgia mud and sweat, but I felt myself becoming someone I barely recognized, someone stronger, someone steadier, someone impossible for Richard to diminish. There were moments I wanted to quit, like when I sprained my ankle during a night movement, or when a peer evaluation criticized my hesitation during a command drill. But every setback reminded me that endurance was part of earning this path. At home, endurance meant survival. Here, endurance meant transformation. The final phase of OCS was a blur of long nights mission planning and cumulative assessments. In our last field exercise, my squad had to maneuver through thick brush under simulated pressure. When morale dropped, I kept everyone focused, reminding them of our training and our objective. When we reached the final checkpoint, my evaluator nodded slightly, a gesture more meaningful than any words. Weeks later, on graduation morning, I stood among the candidates in neatly pressed uniforms. The sun rose over the parade field, casting gold across our formation. As our names were called one by one, I felt a swell of emotion I had never known before. Not pride, exactly, but truth. I belonged here. When my turn came, I stepped forward, received my completion certificate, and knew the next step would change everything. I had earned my commissioning. I had earned a future that held no trace of Richard Hale's control. I was no longer the invisible girl in the small room at the end of the hall. I was Harper Lawson Officer Candidate Graduate, soon to be a second lieutenant in the United States Army, and nothing about that belonged to him. News travels fast in a family when jealousy is already simmering beneath the surface, and in the Hale household, news about me always carried a particular sting. I had barely settled into the final weeks before commissioning when my mother called one evening, her voice thin with the effort of pretending everything was normal. "Harper," she said, "Richard told Brielle the date of your ceremony." I could hear it the moment she said Brielle's name. That familiar twist in my chest, the one I had grown up with. I asked her why he would tell her before he told me, but I already knew the answer. He wanted a reaction, and Brielle never disappointed him. Brielle was 22, then a senior ROTC cadet at the University of Alabama, and on track for her own commissioning the following year. For as long as I could remember, Richard had treated her achievements like trophies he polished daily. "Look at my girl," he would say. "Look at how disciplined she is. Look at her potential. She is the real future officer in this family." I had grown used to hearing that line, though it never stopped cutting. But now that I was weeks away from becoming a commissioned officer, before his biological daughter ever did the narrative he had built around her, began to crack. When Brielle heard the news, she reacted exactly the way he expected. My mother told me she yelled loud enough for neighbors to hear. "How is she getting commissioned before me? She is not even ROTC. This is ridiculous. She probably cheated the process or got lucky." Richard calmed her with the same persuasive tone he used whenever he wanted her to follow his lead. "Do not worry, honey," he said. "We will handle this." The idea that I had earned something without his involvement was an insult he could not tolerate. He needed to regain control of the story. He needed to remind everyone, especially Brielle, that I was meant to stay below her, no matter what I achieved. I later learned that over the next months, he fed her a steady diet of resentment. He told her OCS was easier than ROTC. He told her my success was temporary. He told her I was unprepared for real military life and that she would surpass me quickly. He told her it was unfair that I was receiving my bar first. And she absorbed every word because jealousy had always been easier for her than reflection. When I received her first text message after years of distance, I knew something was off even before opening it. It read simply, "Congrats, I guess. Dad says the ceremony will be interesting." Interesting was not a word Brielle used unless she meant trouble. I ignored it, but the unease settled in the back of my mind like a storm cloud forming. 2 days later, my mother called again, and this time her voice shook. "Harper, your stepdad is planning something for your commissioning." I pressed for details, but she hesitated as if torn between protecting me and protecting the man she still lived with. All she managed to say was, "He keeps saying Brielle deserves recognition too. He keeps saying the Army will see who the real officer is." Those words stopped my breath. I had heard them my entire life. The real daughter, the real star, the real everything. Now he had simply replaced star with officer. His pattern was unmistakable. If something threatened his constructed image, he would sabotage the threat. I was the threat. I tried to push the thought away by focusing on my remaining tasks before graduation, but everywhere I turned, I felt the tension building. During a phone call with a friend from OCS, I mentioned it casually, but he did not laugh. "If your stepdad is the kind of man you describe, just be ready for anything at the ceremony. Parents rarely cause issues there, but when they do, it is messy. Messy was an understatement. Back home, Richard was inflating Brielle's ego daily, convincing her she had been robbed of something she deserved. He reminded her repeatedly that she had ROTC credentials and that people would naturally assume she was the Hale daughter worthy of the uniform. One night, my mother overheard him say during dinner, "Harper may be older, but that does not make her better. Everyone will see that soon." That line told me everything. He was planning something public, something humiliating, something designed to restore Brielle's pedestal and dismantle my accomplishment all at once. It was classic Richard. If private control failed, he escalated to public control. I knew how he operated too well. The closer the ceremony approached, the more frequent the calls from my mother became. Sometimes she whispered like she feared he would hear her through the walls. "I am worried he is going to embarrass you," she said. "He keeps saying things about making a point." A point. That was Richard's favorite justification for cruelty. Make a point, show dominance, correct someone's place. And Brielle, though an adult now, still danced eagerly in the shadow of his approval. When she called me herself one evening, her voice was bright but fake the way people sound when they are trying to bait a reaction. "So you are getting pinned before me. Must be nice skipping the real officer training." I told her calmly that OCS was real training, but she scoffed. "ROTC is harder. Everyone knows that. Dad says the Army probably lowered standards for you." I felt the old ache, but this time something else came with it, a steadiness I had not possessed as a child. I no longer needed their approval or their definition of worth, but I could not ignore what was coming. On the night before the ceremony, my mother called again this time, crying. "He is going to speak in front of everyone," she whispered. "He plans to interrupt. He wants Brielle to stand, and he will say she deserves your place." I closed my eyes, breathing in slow and steady. I knew embarrassment would not be enough for Richard. He wanted spectacle. He wanted me small again, even in a uniform, even with a commission he could not destroy with his bare hands. And Brielle would stand beside him proud to play a role in my humiliation. But what neither of them knew, what neither of them had ever cared to learn, was how long I had been preparing for this moment. They had spent years underestimating me, years teaching me exactly how they operated, years making me quiet enough to observe everything. What they planned for the ceremony would be loud and messy and cruel. But what I had prepared for that same day would be louder and far more devastating, not through spite, but through truth. And truth, unlike humiliation, does not fade when the ceremony ends. The night before my commissioning, I drove to the small hotel just outside Fort Benning, where my mother insisted on meeting me for dinner. She said it would be good for us to talk before the ceremony, that we needed one quiet moment before everything became official. But the moment I walked into the hotel restaurant and saw Richard sitting beside her with a self-satisfied grin, I understood the dinner had never been about peace. It was about positioning, control, his usual game. My mother stood quickly and hugged me, holding on a second longer than normal, as if trying to pass me strength through her hands. "You look wonderful," she whispered, brushing imaginary dust off my sleeve. I could tell she was nervous. Her eyes darted toward Richard every few seconds. She wanted so badly for this night to go smoothly. She wanted to believe he could behave, but I knew better. The waiter seated us at a corner table, dimly lit with a single candle flickering between us. My mother tried to make small talk, asking about the ceremony details, the schedule, who would pin my bars. I answered quietly, but I never let Richard out of my peripheral vision. He sat back in his chair, arms crossed, watching me the way someone watches an opponent before the first round. "So, Officer Lawson," he said slowly, tasting each syllable like a sour fruit, "tomorrow is your big day." I kept my voice steady. "Yes, it is." He smirked. "Amazing what the Army lets slide these days. Standards must be slipping." My mother closed her eyes briefly, a sign she recognized the start of his ritual. "Harper," she murmured, "let's just enjoy dinner, please." But Richard wasn't finished. "Meanwhile, Brielle is doing real officer training. None of that shortcut nonsense. She is earning it the right way." I set my fork down carefully. There was a time when his comments pierced straight through me, a time when I shrank automatically at the sound of his voice. But now, Sitting in my uniform the night before becoming a commissioned officer, something inside me shifted. I no longer felt small. I felt sharpened. I looked him directly in the eye. OCS is not a shortcut. Only 60% of applicants even make it through selection. He raised an eyebrow. And yet somehow you did. Maybe your evaluator had a soft spot. My mother reached for his arm. Richard, please stop. Not tonight. He shook her off gently but firmly, returning his gaze to me. I just want to make sure tomorrow is not embarrassing for you, or for our family. I felt the statement land like a cold slap, but I refused to let him see it. Instead, I took a sip of water and answered calmly. The only embarrassment tomorrow will be whatever you decide to create. The flicker in his eyes told me I had struck a nerve. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. I will say what needs to be said. People should know the truth. This was the closest he had come to admitting his plan. My mother looked between us, panic tightening her features. Harper, honey, maybe just keep things peaceful tomorrow. She was pleading. For me to be small again, for me to bend, for me to absorb whatever damage he delivered so the surface of our family could remain uncracked. I reached for her hand, gently. Mom, I will always treat you with respect, but I won't protect his behavior anymore. Something unreadable crossed her face. Fear, guilt, maybe a small shard of hope, but she didn't speak. The rest of dinner passed in clipped sentences and strained silence. Richard continued making small digs, testing for a reaction. I refused to give him one. When the check came, he insisted on taking it with exaggerated generosity. Don't worry, officer, he said with a grin. I can still afford to feed you. I stood, straightening my jacket. Enjoy it while you can. His smile faltered, just slightly, enough for me to see the first crack. My mother hugged me again in the lobby, whispering, I'm sorry, into my hair. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that she didn't already know. When I finally returned to the elevator, I released a breath I had been holding since the moment Richard walked into the restaurant. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and that was when I saw him. A man in Army Service uniform standing alone near the end of the hallway, reviewing a folder against his forearm. Captain rank, dark hair, focused expression. When he looked up and saw me, his gaze sharpened, evaluating alert, as if he had been waiting for me to arrive. Captain William Torres. I had seen him earlier that day on base, speaking quietly with several instructors near the administrative building. At the time, I assumed he was involved in the ceremony logistics, but now seeing the way he studied me, I realized he had a different purpose. He gave a short nod. Candidate Lawson. I wasn't a candidate anymore, but hearing the title spoken by someone who carried himself with such precision felt grounding. Sir, I answered. He closed the folder, then held it against his side. Big day tomorrow. Congratulations. Thank you, sir. He hesitated, not unsure, but deliberate. The kind of pause someone takes when choosing a careful path through a minefield. If you need anything before the ceremony, my office is on the second floor. His eyes flicked briefly toward the restaurant entrance where Richard's voice still echoed faintly. Then he added quietly, Some situations are easier to manage with support. My breath caught. Did he know something? Had someone reported something? Had Richard done something at the hotel already? Or was Captain Torres investigating him for reasons unrelated to me? The suspense tightened across my shoulders. I studied his face, searching for cues. He didn't break eye contact. His expression held professionalism, but beneath it, something else: awareness, recognition, concern. Not pity. Understanding. Yes, sir, I finally said. I appreciate that. He nodded once firmly, then stepped aside as I walked past him into my room. The moment the door closed behind me, I leaned against it, pulse thudding. Captain Torres had said nothing outright, but everything in his tone had suggested he knew more about Richard than I did. And whatever he knew, he was preparing for tomorrow. The ceremony was no longer just a ceremony. It was a battlefield with uniforms instead of weapons and truth instead of bullets, and I was stepping onto it at dawn. The morning of my commissioning ceremony began with the kind of stillness that feels rehearsed by the world itself. as if Fort Benning had decided to hold its breath just long enough for us to step into a moment we would remember for the rest of our lives. The parade field gleamed under the early Georgia sun. Rows of chairs perfectly aligned, the American flag rippling behind the stage in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Army musicians tuned their instruments with crisp discipline, the metallic notes floating into the air like promises. Families gathered in clusters, murmuring with excitement, pointing toward the stage where newly pressed uniforms waited to be worn by the next generation of officers. My heart beat in a rhythm I recognized not as nerves, but as culmination. Years of being underestimated, years of silence, years of enduring Richard's belittlement. All of it had funneled into this single morning. When my name was announced along with the others, a small cheer rose from somewhere in the crowd. My mother, hands clasped tightly in front of her, stood with tears shining in her eyes. I wondered briefly whether this moment felt like redemption for her too, a moment to rewrite the mistakes she had lived through. I took my place in the line of candidates, the brass buttons on my uniform catching the sunlight, my boots rooted in the perfectly cut grass. Behind us, the military band launched into the opening march, and something inside me steadied. I had earned this. No one could take it from me. At least that was what I believed for exactly 8 more seconds. Because 8 seconds was how long it took for Richard Hale to stand abruptly from his seat near the center aisle, thrust his chest out like a man who believed the world owed him attention, and release. A shout that sliced through the ceremony like a blade. That one. That girl right there. He jabbed a finger toward me. My daughter is the one who deserves to be an officer. Not her conversations stopped mid-sentence. Children froze. The brass section faltered on a note sharp and jarring. Even the flag seemed to pause between gusts of wind. The entire crowd turned toward him with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust, but Richard's face was blazing with certainty, fueled by the self-righteousness he had always wielded like a shield. Beside him, Brielle rose to her feet, chin-lifted eyes brimming with superiority, as if she had been waiting her entire life for this twisted performance. She nodded emphatically, arms crossed. That is right. She barely passed OCS. Dad says I am the real officer. I felt the heat rise beneath my skin, but I did not move. I stood exactly as the drill sergeants taught us, tall spine-locked shoulders, expression controlled. I refused to give him the satisfaction of breaking me on the day I had worked years to reach. But the silence that filled the field was suffocating. A commanding officer stepped forward, face stiff with disapproval, scanning for who had disrupted the ceremony. Conversations resumed in shocked whispers. Who would do that? Is that her father? What is happening? I could hear the ripples of judgment traveling through the crowd, each one landing like a stone in my stomach. A young cadet near the front row whispered to his friend, "That is humiliating, man. On commissioning day, who does that to their kid?" But Richard kept going, his voice swelling louder as if he mistook the silence for an invitation. "My Brielle is the one who trained properly. She earned it. You people are making a mistake." My mother tugged desperately at his arm, pleading with him to sit down, to stop to think, but he shook her off without even glancing at her. This was the moment he had planned, his grand spectacle, his chance to reassert the family hierarchy he feared losing. My throat tightened, but my knees did not buckle. I inhaled through my nose, exhaled through my mouth, and focused on the horizon line, the way I had learned during field exercises. Control the body, control the mind. A movement near the back of the ceremony caught my attention. JAG. Captain William Torres was already on his feet, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked not on me, but on Richard. He whispered something to the senior JAG officer beside him while jotting notes into a small notebook. Only later would I learn that disruptions of official military ceremonies, especially those involving targeted humiliation, fall under Department of Defense harassment provisions, and Richard had just violated them in front of officers, families, cadets, and a JAG team documenting every detail. But in that moment, all I felt was the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing against my skin, waiting to see what I would do, waiting to see whether I would crumble. waiting to see whether I would confirm Richard's cruel narrative about who deserved to wear the uniform. I lifted my chin and stood perfectly still. If pain lived anywhere inside me, it did not leak through my expression. The commanding officer signaled the band to stop entirely, and for a breathless moment, the field existed in complete silence again. The kind of silence that marks a turning point even before anyone realizes one has begun. Captain Torres stepped forward, slightly folding his hands behind his back, watching closely. I did not know then what he had already discovered about Richard. I did not know that JAG had been quietly compiling complaints, financial records, and statements. I did not yet realize that my commissioning day humiliation was not just witnessed, it was officially recorded. All I knew was that this was the moment Richard had waited months for. But what he did not know was that tomorrow's consequences had already begun today, and I had arrived prepared. After the ceremony was paused and the crowd slowly dispersed under the direction of staff, I was escorted by a protocol NCO toward a small administrative building near the parade field. My boots echoed against the tile as we entered a quiet hallway that seemed to absorb sound rather than carry it. The air was too still, too controlled, and before the NCO even spoke, I knew exactly who would be waiting for me. Captain William Torres stood inside a modest conference room, hands clasped behind his back, posture straight with the effortless authority that came from years in uniform. The moment the door closed, he motioned toward a chair. "Have a seat, Lieutenant Lawson." His voice carried no judgment, only purpose. I sat slowly, my uniform stiff, my pulse still thrumming from the chaos on the field. He studied me for several seconds before speaking, as though assessing not just what had happened, but how I had absorbed it. First, he said what occurred out there was unacceptable. No candidate, no future officer deserves to be publicly targeted at her own commissioning. I nodded once, not trusting myself to speak yet. He pulled out a thin folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table. "We were already looking into your stepfather before today." That sentence made my breath hitch. "Richard. Why?" Captain Torres leaned forward, lowering his voice even though the room was sealed. "There have been irregularities in documents submitted to the VA under his name. Claims of service-connected disability, financial aid requests, dependency forms. But when cross-checked, none of his supposed service records exist." My stomach twisted. I had known Richard manipulated countless parts of our lives, but the idea of him exploiting military systems meant for those who sacrificed hit deeper than I expected. Torres continued, eyes fixed on me. "He has been using his proximity to you and later to your stepsister to imply military affiliation he does not have. That opens the door to fraud, misrepresentation, and misuse of federal benefit programs. We have been building a case quietly, but the public nature of today's incident elevated the urgency. I listened, absorbing every word, feeling the pieces of my past rearranging themselves into a picture I had suspected but never fully understood. He asked carefully, "Has he ever pressured you for documents, signatures, anything involving your identity?" This was the moment I had been preparing for since the day I tucked the folder into my bag. For years, I carried the weight of knowing what Richard had done to my finances, my records, and my name. For years, I stayed quiet because speaking up meant detonating the fragile peace my mother clung to. But that silence had never been consent. I reached into my rucksack and pulled out the black folder. The room seemed to contract as I set it on the table. Torres's eyes narrowed with immediate recognition. This was not a personal file. It was evidence. I slid it toward him. "Everything he made me sign is in here. Every form he forged, every document he told me to pretend I didn't understand." Torres opened the folder slowly as if bracing for impact. The first page showed a loan application submitted in my name when I was 19, a loan Richard pocketed while telling me I had no concept of adult responsibility. The next page held copies of dependency forms he filed to claim me as a dependent long after I reached adulthood. Another page showed his false statements about being my financial sponsor for supposed military-related expenses he fabricated. He flipped through them faster and faster until he finally stopped exhaling sharply. "Lieutenant Lawson, he said, his voice low and astonished. "How long have you had this?" I met his gaze steadily, long enough to know this day would come. He closed the folder and pressed his palms flat on top of it, absorbing the weight of what he had just seen. "You understand what this means," he said quietly. "These documents alone could initiate a federal fraud case. Combined with what we already have, this is substantial." I nodded. He leaned back, studying me differently now. Not as someone who had been humiliated in front of hundreds, but as someone who had walked into this room prepared to expose years of hidden wounds. "Why didn't you report this earlier?" The question was gentle, not accusatory. I took a slow breath. Because my mother depended on him. Because I was trying to survive. Because until I joined the army, I didn't think anyone would believe me over him. He considered that for a long moment. Then he said something that pierced straight through the armor I had built over years of silence. "We believe you, and we take this seriously. You are not alone in this." I swallowed hard. It had been a long time since anyone had said those words to me without conditions. He tapped the folder lightly. "This evidence will be secured immediately. CID will review it before the day is over. You may be asked to give a formal statement, and if charges move forward, you will be notified." I felt something unfamiliar unfurl inside me, not relief, but the beginning of it, the beginning of justice. Torres straightened his uniform jacket and added, "Today he tried to break you publicly. What he didn't know is that he walked directly into an active investigation, and that you came armed with truth." I exhaled slowly, feeling the ground beneath me shift. For the first time, Richard's power was not absolute, not over my future, not over my identity, not over the narrative he had controlled for so many years. Torres gathered the documents, slid them into a secured envelope, and stood. "We will take it from here, Lieutenant." But he paused before leaving his hand on the door. "One more thing," he said without turning. "After today, nothing about your stepfather's life will remain hidden. The truth begins now." And with that, he stepped out, leaving me alone in the room, with the echo of a lifetime's worth of silence finally cracking open. When Captain Torres left the room and the door clicked softly behind him, the silence that followed was thick enough to feel like a second presence pressing against my chest. I stared at the empty chair he had occupied only moments earlier, the secured envelope now in his possession, carrying pieces of my past that I had kept hidden for years. As the adrenaline from the ceremony faded, memories I had long forced into the background surged forward with startling clarity. I could still see myself at 19 sitting at the rickety kitchen table in the Hale house with a stack of community college assignments spread around me. It was late, the kind of late when the refrigerator hum feels louder than it should and the hallway shadows stretch long enough to make you uneasy. My mother had gone to sleep hours before. Richard entered the kitchen without a sound, a stack of papers in his hand and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Harper signed these for me," he said, casually dropping them on top of my homework. "They are just financial aid forms. Nothing complicated." I frowned, flipping through them. They didn't look like the FAFSA forms I had seen in school. These had loan company logos and sections I didn't understand. I remember asking him what they were exactly, and he waved the question away with a flick of his hand, as if I were a child asking about algebra. "They are parent-sponsored education loans," he said. "Your mother asked me to help manage them since she is overwhelmed. Just sign where I highlighted." But something about the way the pages were already marked, already organized in the order he wanted, made a cold awareness settle in my stomach. Still at 19, still living under his roof, still watching him control every corner of our household. I hesitated only a moment before picking up the pen. He was the head of the family. He made the financial decisions. He repeated that daily until it became a script I knew by heart. I signed the first page slowly, my name looking shaky. When I handed the pen back, a flicker of triumph passed through his expression so fast I almost doubted I had seen it. It wasn't until months later, when a strange envelope arrived addressed to me, that the truth became impossible to ignore. The letter stated plainly that my repayment period would begin in 6 months. Repayment for what I didn't have any loans in my name. I hadn't even finished the coursework I needed. My heart pounded as I read the details 3 times over. It listed loan disbursement dates I had never authorized, amounts I had never requested, and an account number linked to a bank card I had never seen. The loan wasn't for my education. He had taken it. He had used my name, my credit, my identity. I remembered walking into the living room holding the letter, my hands trembling, my voice barely a whisper. "What did you do?" He didn't even look up from the TV. "Calm down, Harper. It is just a loan. Everyone takes loans. I wasn't angry yet. Just scared. Why is it in my name? Why didn't you ask me?" He sighed, finally, muting the television as if I were an inconvenience rather than a daughter whose life he had just altered. "I told you to sign the forms. You didn't ask questions then." Too late now. I stood frozen as he continued. "You want a place to live, you want food, you want your mother taken care of. Then sometimes you help the family. That is all this is. Helping." When I threatened to tell my mother, his expression shifted into something colder than I had ever seen. "If you say a word," he said quietly, "she will lose everything. Her job, her car, her insurance. You think she can pay the bills alone? You think she can survive without me?" His voice lowered to a razor edge. "If you ruin this household, Harper, it will be your fault. Yours, not mine." His control over my mother had trapped me, too. For her sake, for my fear, for my lack of power at 19, I stayed silent. I hid the loan documents under my mattress and learned to live with the cold dread that came from knowing someone else was steering the course of my future without my consent. Years later, when I left for college and later for the Army, I carried those documents with me, not because I thought they would help me, but because they were proof of what I had survived. Proof that I wasn't crazy. Proof that the gaslighting had been real. Proof that Richard Hale had built his entire authority on lies, coercion, and manipulation. Now, sitting in the JAG conference room, those papers were no longer just ghosts of an old wound. They were evidence, federal evidence. When Torres returned 15 minutes later, he carried himself with the same professionalism, but there was something sharper in his eyes, something more focused. "Lawson, after reviewing the documents, there is no question. This has to go to CID. My breath caught. CID. Criminal Investigation Division. Everything grew very still. That means, he continued, this is no longer just a family issue. What he did crosses the threshold into federal financial exploitation and identity fraud. We take these cases extremely seriously, more seriously than he realizes. The shift in power was so sudden, so seismic, I could almost feel the floor tilt beneath my boots. For years, Richard had dictated the terms of my life with ease. But in a single morning, in a single meeting, the balance had shifted entirely. Torres placed the secured envelope into a locked case. "I will speak with CID this afternoon," he said. "You may be contacted for further statements." For the first time since childhood, I felt something I had never associated with Richard Hale: leverage. The truth was no longer buried. The lies were no longer protected. The man who had tormented my mother and me for years had finally stepped into a system where manipulation would not save him. Captain Torres paused at the door, meeting my eyes. "Today was difficult, Lieutenant. But make no mistake, this is the beginning of accountability." When he left, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The weight of years pressed hard against me, then slowly lifted. For the first time in my life, power was shifting away from Richard and toward me. The next 48 hours unfolded with the kind of precision that only military investigations seem to possess. Each step quiet on the surface, yet carrying consequences that rolled forward like distant thunder. While CID began organizing interviews and gathering the financial documents Captain Torres had submitted, another thread of the investigation pulled tight, one I had suspected existed for years, but never imagined would come to light so quickly. Brielle. For as long as I could remember, Richard had spoken of her as if she were carved from something finer than the rest of us. Perfect daughter. Future officer, real Hale. But perfection built on fraudulent foundations cracks fast once someone starts looking closely. And CID was looking very closely. On the morning after my initial meeting with JAG, Captain Torres returned with a different energy, more resolved, more certain, as though he had found confirmation for something he had suspected long before I ever handed him my black folder. "Lawson," he said as he entered the room, "we need to discuss additional findings." He laid several papers on the desk in front of me. These were copies of forms Brielle submitted through her university's ROTC program. At first glance, they looked legitimate contact information, financial declarations, dependency statements. But beneath the surface, discrepancies glowed like warning lights. Incorrect dates, signatures that didn't match prior submissions, a dependency certification naming her father as financially supporting 2 adult children, me included, long after I had left the household. I felt the air go thin. Brielle put my name on her ROTC paperwork. Torres nodded. She claimed dual dependent status in order to qualify for increased housing allowances and certain ROTC reimbursements. He tapped the signature line with his pen. "This signature does not match your verified signature on file, and you never authorized being listed as a dependent. Correct, sir." He sat back, the weight of the information settling into the room. These inconsistencies triggered a review with the university's ROTC command. They have been very cooperative. A stillness grew in my chest, not relief, not satisfaction exactly, but the slow understanding that the web Richard had spun had extended so far that even Brielle, his golden child, was entangled in it. Torres continued, his voice even but firm. During interviews, it became clear that Brielle knowingly submitted forms containing false information. When questioned, she first stated that Richard filled everything out and she only signed. Then she contradicted herself, claiming she handled the paperwork but didn't pay attention to the details. Neither explanation aligns with the evidence. I pictured Brielle at 12 smirking as she received gift after gift while I was handed a sweater. I pictured her at 15 bragging about vacations I wasn't invited to. I pictured her at 18 looking down on me as if status were hereditary and she had been born with a higher rank. And then I pictured her at 22 willingly signing her name on fraudulent documents because her father told her it was fine, because in their house rules were always adjustable. Consequences were for other people, not for Hales. But now the army, the institution Brielle wanted so badly to belong to, had seen the truth. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. Torres folded his hands. "The ROTC command has initiated formal review. Filing false documents is a violation of Army Cadet Command regulations. At minimum, she faces suspension. Expulsion is very possible." I inhaled slowly, letting the reality settle. Brielle had always believed her path to a commission was guaranteed, paved by Richard's force of will and her own entitlement. Now that path was caving in under her own choices. Torres added, "There is also the matter of public misconduct during your ceremony. Her participation in your stepfather's outburst was noted by several officers. That will factor into their evaluation." For a moment, I just sat there absorbing the shift. Richard's humiliation had been loud theatrical designed for maximum impact. Brielle's downfall, however, was unraveling quietly professionally through the very system she believed she belonged to. Public shame was no longer only directed at me. It was turning inch by inch toward them. That afternoon, as I walked across the courtyard outside the admin building, I received a text from an unknown number. It was a single message. "Did you tell them?" At first, I didn't recognize the number, but the frantic text that followed gave it away. "You are ruining my life. Why are you doing this? Everything is falling apart." I didn't respond. I didn't owe her my emotional labor, not anymore. Another message came seconds later. "Dad said you would lash out. He said you were jealous of me." I stopped walking, my jaw tightening. Even facing investigation, even with her future collapsing, Brielle still clung to Richard's mythology that I was the villain for refusing to stay beneath them. I finally typed a short reply. "I didn't do this. You did." There was no response after that. Word spread quickly among those who attended the ceremony. The same people who had witnessed my humiliation were now whispering about the Hale family in very different tones. Parents who had turned to stare at me the day before now shook their heads at Richard's arrogance and Brielle's entitlement. Someone told me they overheard a colonel remark, "I have never seen such disrespect at a commissioning. Completely unacceptable." By evening, the story had traveled through the commanding officers, cadets, family members, JAG offices, and ROTC contacts. It was no longer about my embarrassment. It was about their exposure. The house of cards that Richard had built on intimidation, manipulation, and forged papers was collapsing in a neatly documented, professionally executed chain reaction. As the sun dipped below the barracks and the sky turned amber, I found myself sitting on a bench near the flagpole. For the first time in years, I didn't feel overshadowed. I felt in motion, forward, towards something that finally resembled justice. When Captain Torres passed by on his way to an evening briefing, he paused. "Rough few days," he said, "but I want you to understand something. You didn't cause their downfall. You just stopped carrying their secrets, and that lieutenant takes real courage." As he walked away, I looked up at the flag above me shifting in the evening wind and realized that power, the kind they had hoarded for decades, was finally changing hands, and for once it was changing in my favor. The meeting was scheduled for 900 at a conference room inside Fort Benning's training headquarters, a place normally used for coordination between commanders and instructors. That morning, however, every seat was filled with representatives from JAG ROTC leadership from the University of Alabama, 2 CID agents, and several senior officers who had witnessed the commissioning ceremony. The atmosphere carried the same heavy tension as a courtroom, only here the walls were covered, not with wood paneling, but with framed photos of soldiers in training American flags and plaques from past units. At the far end of the long table sat Captain Torres, composed and unshakable. As always, a stack of organized documents in front of him. I entered quietly and took my seat near the left side where I had a full view of everyone but didn't sit at the center. This wasn't about spotlight. This was about truth. Richard and Brielle entered last. Richard strode in with misplaced confidence, chest puffed out as if he were reporting for inspection, though the slight tremble in his hands betrayed him. Brielle walked behind him, her eyes red and swollen like she had spent the night crying. She wore her ROTC polo and slacks, an outfit meant to convey professionalism, but her shoulders slumped as though she knew the fabric could not protect her from what was coming. When the door closed, Colonel Atkins from the ROTC command cleared his throat. "For the record, this meeting is to address allegations of falsified documents submitted to ROTC misuse of military-related benefits and misconduct during an official commissioning ceremony." Richard scoffed loudly. "Allegations," he repeated. "That's all this is. Allegations made by an ungrateful girl who can't." Captain Torres raised a hand, calmly silencing him without a word. "Sir, you will have your opportunity to respond when we ask for it. Today we begin with evidence." He opened the folder and began laying out documents across the table one by one. Bank statements showing fraudulent charges, dependency forms mismatched with my legal status, loan documents bearing Richard's handwriting and my forged signature from when I was 19, ROTC reimbursement requests signed by Brielle that listed dependents she wasn't entitled to claim. Every sheet of paper seemed to echo when Torres placed it down like the sound was traveling deeper into the room than it should. "These are the documents provided by Lieutenant Lawson Torres," stated his tone neutral and steady. "They have been verified against federal and state databases. In addition, CID has conducted preliminary background checks confirming the signatures on these forms do not match verified records from Ms. Lawson." He slid the last page forward. "And these were used to obtain both financial benefits and housing allowances to which neither party was entitled." My heart thudded steadily but calmly. This was no longer private pain. This was public exposure executed professionally, legally, and undeniably. Colonel Atkins leaned in and picked up one of the forms. His brow tightened. "Cadet Hale, please stand." Brielle rose slowly, trembling. Atkins held up the paper. "Did you submit this dependency verification as part of your ROTC financial aid package?" Brielle's voice cracked. "My dad, he filled out some of it, I just—" Atkins cut her off tone, sharp but controlled. "Did you sign it?" She swallowed. "Yes, sir." Then his voice hardened. "Cadet Brielle Hale, you have submitted false statements to ROTC, a violation of Army Cadet Command regulation. You misrepresented your dependency status and knowingly obtained financial benefits under false pretenses." Brielle's knees buckled slightly and she grabbed the back of her chair. Her eyes flicked toward me, pleading for something mercy intervention, an escape from the consequences she had brought on herself. I didn't move. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because this was not my lesson to teach. This was hers to learn. Richard slammed his hands onto the table, the sound exploding through the room like a gunshot. Enough of this. My daughter earned everything she got. These papers don't mean anything. That girl he jabbed a finger at me set this whole thing up. She's always been jealous. Everyone knows it. The room went silent except for the faint hum of the ceiling vents. Then CID Agent Morrison, a tall man with an expression carved from stone, spoke for the first time. "Sir, you will refrain from raising your voice." Richard growled fumes, practically rising from him. "These so-called investigators don't know what they're talking about. I provided for that girl. She owes me. She owes—" His words exploded into anger, and he slammed the table again, even harder. This time, the military police officers stationed at the door stepped forward immediately. One placed a firm hand on Richard's shoulder. "Sir, you need to sit down." Richard jerked his arm away. "Don't touch me. I am not the one who should be on trial here." He took a step forward as if he meant to lunge across the table. The MPs reacted instantly, gripping his arms and securing him in place before he could move any further. Chairs scraped. A few officers flinched. Brielle gasped. But I did not move. I simply watched, silent, steady, witnessing the end of a man who had spent years weaponizing my silence. Torres raised one eyebrow unshaken. "Thank you, MPs. Please keep him seated." Richard was forced into a chair, breathing heavily, his face turning a deep shade of red. The entire room seemed frozen, caught between shock and disbelief. Torres looked around and continued in a level voice. "As you can all see, this behavior aligns with the patterns described during interviews. Attempts at intimidation, volatile reactions when confronted with evidence, a disregard for procedural conduct." He turned a page calmly. "And this will be included in the final report." Brielle stared at her father, horror spreading across her face as she understood that not only was her future collapsing, but she was witnessing the undoing of the man she believed was invincible. No one applauded, no one cheered. But there was an unmistakable shift, a realization that the truth once buried had surfaced with a force no one in the Hale family could control. For the first time in my life, surrounded by people who saw what I endured instead of dismissing it, I felt something I hadn't known in years. Not victory, not triumph, just freedom. I looked at Richard, then at Brielle, and knew this moment would stay with them forever. The day the lies ended. The day the truth stood taller than both of them. The day the room saw me not as the invisible girl in their shadow, but as the officer who finally stepped into her own strength. The fallout began faster than anyone expected, unfolding with the cold precision of a machine that had already been running long before any of us realized it. By the next morning, Brielle received an official notice from the University of Alabama ROTC Command informing her that she was suspended indefinitely pending a full misconduct review. Suspension alone was devastating, but the next line delivered the blow she feared most. Her ROTC scholarship had been revoked effective immediately. Brielle had always believed the world would rearrange itself to accommodate her dreams, but now her dream was dissolving in front of her in a sterile email she read while sitting in her dorm's hallway crying so loudly that her suitemates closed their doors. Torres later told me that ROTC programs rarely tolerate any falsification of records. The military demands integrity, and once you break that trust before you even commission, the system closes its doors. Brielle spent years believing her uniform was guaranteed. Now it was gone because of a signature she should never have written. Richard's consequences came heavier, sharper, and federal. CID formally referred his case to the U.S. Attorney's Office for possible charges, including fraud impersonation and misuse of federal financial systems. The most damning charge impersonation came from the forged loan documents he created using my information when I was 19. It wasn't just unethical, it was a federal offense. When the agents explained the nature of the charges, Richard shouted that he had every right to use my name because he took care of me, a statement they quietly transcribed word for word because it only further confirmed the pattern of control they were investigating. Within 72 hours, a judge approved a temporary freeze on 2 of Richard's accounts pending further review, and the VA began its own internal audit regarding the benefits he applied for under false pretenses. The man who strutted into my commissioning ceremony with the confidence of someone who believed he owned the world now faced the real possibility of federal prison. That shift was not satisfying. It was sobering. Because no matter what he had done, he had been a central pillar in my mother's life for 16 years. And the moment reality caught up with him, she collapsed under the weight of a truth she had refused to see. I drove back to Knoxville 2 days after the hearing because my mother called me with a voice so thin I barely recognized it. When I stepped inside the house, the place felt smaller, dimmer, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the chaos of the last week. She was sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking. The moment she saw me, her face crumpled. "I should have protected you," she whispered. The sentence broke something inside me, not in a painful way, but in a way that released years of tension I didn't know I was carrying. She admitted she had ignored the signs out of fear, out of dependence, out of the belief that Richard's anger was normal, that his control was just parenting, and that if she stayed quiet, the storm would pass. Instead, it only grew. She confessed she had known something was wrong with the paperwork Richard submitted, but every time she asked, he threatened to leave to cut off money to destroy her financially. Her voice shook as she said, "I didn't know he used your name. I didn't know Harper." I sat across from her, absorbing each trembling word. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to ask why she stayed. I wanted to ask why she didn't believe me when I tried to tell her small pieces of truth over the years. But instead, I simply said, "I know." Because I did know. Abuse hollows people. It reshapes their judgment until they can't tell which way is up. Richard had controlled her for so long that she no longer trusted her own instincts. She cried for a long time, hands shaking, as she finally saw the man she married for who he truly was, not the protector he pretended to be. And in the quiet between her sobs, I felt something unexpected relief. Not joy, not vengeance, relief, because the truth was out. And the truth did not waver no matter how much Richard raged against it. That night, after she fell asleep on the couch, I walked through the house, slowly touching the backs of chairs. The edges of picture frames, the familiar corners of hallways where I once tiptoed as a teenager trying not to trigger one of Richard's moods. Everything felt different now. Lighter. Like there was finally air in the rooms again. Even though the consequences were harsh, even though the family I knew had fractured beyond repair, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. The cost of truth is always lower than the cost of silence. Over the next week, Brielle bombarded me with messages, long, frantic paragraphs blaming me for ruining her career, her reputation, her life. Not once did she acknowledge her choices. Not once did she say she was sorry. It was always me destroying her future, me exposing their secrets, me taking everything from her. She couldn't comprehend that this wasn't punishment. It was accountability. And accountability only hurts when you've built your identity on escaping it. Meanwhile, Richard's lawyer tried calling me 3 times, leaving vague messages about resolving misunderstandings. I did not return the calls. There was nothing to resolve. Harper Lawson was no longer the girl who stayed silent to keep a household calm. I was a commissioned officer now, and with that role came something I had earned not through favoritism, not through inheritance, not through manipulation, but through discipline, integrity, and years of pushing forward despite every obstacle they placed in front of me. For the first time in my life, my reflection matched the person I felt inside. Steady, capable, unafraid. The fallout was painful, yes, but it was also freeing. And as the dust settled, I finally stepped out from under the Hale family's shadow and into my own light. 3 weeks after the federal charges were filed, just when life at Fort Benning was beginning to quiet, and I finally felt my mind settling into something close to peace. The audacity return arrived exactly the way men like Richard always deliver it, not through accountability, not through reflection, but through desperation, dressed up as affection. The letter came in a plain white envelope marked with the logo of the Federal Detention Center in Atlanta. At first, I almost tossed it into the trash unread, assuming it was a legal notice or paperwork forwarding. But when I saw his handwriting, sharp, aggressive strokes softened only by the tremor of someone who had finally lost control, I felt my stomach tighten. I opened it slowly. Harper, it began, as if he were writing to a beloved daughter instead of the one he spent 16 years diminishing. I know things have been difficult between us, but I want you to understand that I never meant for any of this to happen. I raised you. I fed you. I gave you a home. Surely you remember that. You always were the responsible one, the smart one, the one who would know what to do. I need your help now. My lawyer says a character letter from you could reduce my sentence. You know I'm not a bad man. You know I only ever did what I thought was right for this family. Please, I am asking you for forgiveness. You're the only one who can fix this. Your father, Richard. I read the letter twice then, a third time, each sentence dripping with the kind of manipulation he used my entire childhood claiming credit for necessities, rewriting history, so he appeared noble. Pretending the harm he inflicted was simply misunderstood caring. Even now, sitting in a federal facility facing charges, he positioned himself as a victim of circumstance. Not once did he apologize for stealing my identity. Not once did he acknowledge the years he spent undercutting my self-worth. And not once ever did he speak of responsibility. Only favors he expected. From a daughter he believed would always bend. For a moment, I stared at the words your father at the bottom of the page. Then I folded the letter neatly and slid it back into the envelope. I did not respond. He no longer had the right to claim that title. 2 days later came Brielle. My phone lit up with her name just after sunset. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but something in my chest told me to answer not for her sake, but for mine. The moment I said hello, all I heard was sobbing. Not quiet tears, but the frantic, choking kind that comes when someone's world collapses and they finally realize the ground beneath them was never solid. "Harper!" she cried, her voice splitting. "Please, please, you have to help me. They're expelling me. I'll lose my apartment. I'll have to leave school. You know I didn't mean for any of this to go that far. I just did what Dad told me." I didn't speak, letting her words tumble out like loose debris. She kept going. "They said the paperwork affects my stipend, and now I owe money back. Harper, they're saying I can't reapply next year, that I might never commission. My future is gone." Her voice cracked high and sharp. "You ruined everything." That sentence snapped something clean inside me, because there it was again, the Hale family's creed. Nothing was their fault. Responsibility was a foreign language. The consequences of their actions were always someone else's doing. I let a few seconds of silence stretch long enough for her sobs to echo in her own ears. Then I spoke in a voice colder and steadier than I expected. "Your future was not mine to ruin, Brielle. You ruined it yourself the moment you signed documents you knew were false." She inhaled sharply as if the truth physically struck her. I pressed on. "You wanted the title without the integrity. You wanted the benefits without the service. You wanted shortcuts because Dad told you the rules didn't apply to you. They do. They always did. And now you're learning that the uniform isn't a costume you can slip into because someone at home tells you you're special. You have to earn it. Every day." Another broken sob. I could picture her on the floor somewhere, maybe in her apartment, maybe in a stairwell at school, hugging herself as the entitlement she'd been raised on finally crumbled. "Harper, please," she whispered. "Can't you tell them something, that you forgive me, that you don't want this? That would help my case." I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling the quiet around me, letting my heartbeat settle into the certainty of what I needed to say. "No, Brielle, I won't lie for you, and I won't save you from the consequences you chose." Then gently, but with unshakable finality, I delivered the sentence that ended her last attempt to pull me back into their chaos. "Your future fell apart because of decisions you made, not because of anything I did. You did this, not me." She went silent, not even breathing into the receiver. Then the line clicked dead. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the wall across from me, letting the weight of the conversation settle. It didn't feel triumphant. It didn't feel vindictive. It felt necessary, like closing a door that had been left open for far too long. Over the next week, messages from unknown numbers came in, some pleading, some angry, all variations of the same demand: fix this. But I did not respond. I finally understood something that took me 27 years to learn. Family is not defined by obligation. Abuse does not become love because someone insists it should, and forgiveness is not owed simply because someone suddenly wants the consequences to stop. Richard and Brielle had spent years believing they were untouchable, and now they wanted me to be the parachute for a fall they created. But I was done catching them. I folded Richard's letter one last time, walked it out behind the barracks, and dropped it into the burn bin used for shredded classified waste. Watching the paper curl and blacken, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. They no longer had claim over my life. They no longer had access to my obedience. They no longer had the privilege of my silence. The fire consumed the last of the envelope, and I whispered the truth out loud, not for them, but for me. I am finally free. In the weeks that followed the investigation's hearings and the implosion of the Hale family narrative, the world around me finally stopped shaking. It didn't stop moving, military life never does, but the tremors inside me began to ease, replaced by something steadier. Something I had never felt growing up under Richard's shadow: the possibility of peace. Captain Torres called me into his office one quiet afternoon long after the commotion had worn off. His workspace was neat as always, everything squared away with the kind of precision only an experienced JAG officer maintains. He looked up from his desk, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Lawson, sit down for a moment," he said. I did. He folded his hands, leaning forward. "Your composure through all of this was exemplary. Command noticed. JAG noticed. More importantly, I noticed." He cleared his throat almost awkwardly. "We have an opening for temporary administrative support here at the JAG office. It's not flashy, but you would be assisting with case management documentation review and liaising with CID when needed. Frankly, we could use someone with your clarity." I blinked. "Sir, I've only just commissioned." He nodded. "And nothing in your orders prevents you from taking a temporary assignment before your first duty station, especially one that builds legal and administrative experience. Plus," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "working here may give you the breathing room you need before you step fully into the officer world." He didn't say trauma. He didn't say recovery. He didn't say healing. But I heard all of it in the quiet respect behind his tone. I accepted the position. And for the first time in my life, a decision I made wasn't in response to a crisis. It was a step toward something better. When my orders for the temporary assignment came through, they stationed me in Savannah, Georgia, where the Eastern Regional JAG office handled a high volume of administrative cases. I packed my things into 2 duffel bags and left Fort Benning behind, driving 4 hours toward a coastline I had only seen in photos. Savannah greeted me with oak trees draped in Spanish moss cobblestone streets and the soft smell of the Atlantic hanging in the air. Everything felt quieter there, gentler. I rented a small apartment near Victory Drive. Nothing extravagant, but clean, sunlit, and mine. The first morning I woke up there, sunlight poured through the blinds in wide golden stripes, and I lay still for a moment, listening to nothing at all. Silence had never felt safe growing up. Silence meant Richard's mood was about to shift, that tension was building, that someone would soon be scolded or belittled or reminded of their place. Now, silence felt like a gift. JAG work was steady, structured, and grounding. I spent hours organizing case files, processing requests, summarizing legal correspondence, and supporting Torres remotely as he wrapped up the Hale case. For the first time, I worked in an environment where people didn't speak to me through frustration or sarcasm. They called me Lieutenant Lawson, not girl, not you, not the other one. They asked for my recommendations. They valued my attention to detail. They trusted my judgment. And slowly, without me noticing, at first, a strange thing began to happen. I stopped bracing myself for criticism that never came. I also started therapy, a step the Army strongly encourages for anyone recovering from traumatic family experiences or emotional stress. My therapist, Captain Rowe, was gentle but firm, guiding me through the years I spent shrinking myself so Richard wouldn't erupt, the years I spent invisible so Brielle could shine, the years I learned to survive by being quiet. She asked questions no one had ever asked me before. Why did you believe their version of you? When did you start thinking your worth was conditional? What part of you are you ready to meet now that they're gone? I left each session exhausted but lighter, as if someone were slowly untying knots that had been pulled tight since childhood. Cutting ties with Richard and Brielle was not a dramatic event. It was simple, final, and quiet. I blocked their numbers. I deleted their emails unread. I returned no calls from lawyers or family friends pleading for reconciliation. I told myself the truth: peace is not built in the same room where you were broken. But the hardest part, the part that took the most emotional strength, was my mother. She called one morning from Knoxville, her voice trembling. "Harper." I left him. I sat down slowly, the world narrowing to her words. When last night she whispered, "I couldn't stay after everything came out. I couldn't live with the lies anymore. And I couldn't forgive myself for letting you grow up in that house." She cried, not the frantic crying she did during the fallout, but a softer, more honest release. A mother finally seeing her daughter without the fog of fear. I didn't offer immediate forgiveness. I didn't rush to soothe her. Instead, I listened. She told me she found a small rental near the Tennessee River that she was staying with a coworker for now that she had filed for divorce, and asked for guidance from a victim support advocate. I realized then she was beginning her own healing not because of me, but because she finally chose herself. And in that way, we were repairing together from two different states, two different lives, two different versions of the past. My transformation didn't happen all at once. It happened in the tiny, everyday moments, choosing my own meals without hearing Richard's criticism, running along Savannah's riverfront without listening for someone shouting behind me, wearing my uniform without feeling like an imposter next to Brielle's arrogance, sitting in my apartment knowing no one could burst through the door demanding obedience. And the biggest transformation of all, finally seeing myself not as the girl who endured, but as the woman who overcame. One afternoon, as I walked out of the JAG office, Torres called after me. "Lawson," he said, smiling slightly, "you're doing good work. More importantly, you're becoming someone who stands tall even in silence." I thanked him, but the truth was I didn't fully understand what he meant until weeks later when I caught my reflection in a shop window downtown. Shoulders relaxed, chin steady, eyes clear. For the first time, I saw someone I recognized. Healing had begun. Transformation was underway, and the past with all its sharp edges was finally losing its power to cut. Strength did not come to me as a bolt of lightning or a dramatic revelation. It arrived quietly in steady waves, almost imperceptible at first, building inside me as I rebuilt a life without the weight of Richard and Brielle pressing on my shoulders. Day after day in Savannah, I felt something unfamiliar forming beneath my ribs. Not fear, not vigilance, but resolve. It was the first time in my life that strength grew without being defensive, without being born from survival. It was simply mine. The longer I worked with JAG, the more I understood why Torres had chosen the words he did. Quiet strength. I used to think strength meant shouting or pushing back or proving myself until my voice cracked. But here, in the calm rhythm of legal briefs and administrative order, I discovered a deeper version of it, one that existed even when no one was watching. I helped review case files involving service members who were navigating complex financial disputes or family hardship. I spoke to exhausted spouses, young soldiers overwhelmed by paperwork, and officers balancing responsibilities beyond what anyone outside the military could understand. And in those interactions, I saw a reflection of myself, the girl who once had no advocate now becoming someone who understood exactly how to guide others through turmoil with clarity and steadiness. The shift did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, I was called into a meeting room where Lieutenant Colonel Reeves, the regional JAG commander, stood reviewing a binder full of recent case summaries. He looked up as I entered, offering a crisp nod. "Lawson, take a seat." My heart thudded once, instinctively bracing, though I did not know for what. Reeves flipped to another page, tapping his pen lightly. "I was reviewing the Hale investigation and your statements." Then his eyes lifted to mine. "And I want to commend you. Your cooperation with JAG and CID was exemplary. Your documentation was thorough, your conduct professional, and your resilience evident in every phase." I felt my breath catch. For years, Richard used the word resilience as an insult, a way to say I should endure silently. but hearing it now from a commander who meant it as respect changed something inside me. Reeves continued, "You handled yourself in a situation that would have broken many. You showed integrity, discipline, and restraint. Those qualities matter immensely in this branch." He paused, almost as if choosing his next words carefully. "You embody quiet strength, Lieutenant." It was the first time anyone had used that phrase to describe me directly, and hearing it spoken aloud solidified something I had only begun to recognize in myself. After the meeting, Torres caught up with me in the hallway, a rare grin crossing his face. "Not bad, Lieutenant. Not bad at all." When he said it, I felt the full weight of the journey I had taken from Knoxville to Fort Benning to Savannah. I realized that strength was no longer something I had to force or chase. It had become part of me. As spring approached, the JAG office planned a small recognition gathering for administrative and legal support staff. Nothing extravagant, just a modest ceremony in the courtyard outside the building where the sun filtered through the branches of live oak trees and everyone mingled in relaxed conversation. I wore my service uniform, feeling more grounded in it than ever before. The ribbon bar on my chest was small, modest, but it represented something monumental to me, a path that belonged solely to my choosing. When Lieutenant Colonel Reeves called my name, the courtyard fell into a soft hush. Harper Lawson stepped forward. I walked toward him steady and composed. Reeves held a small velvet box in his hand. Inside was a challenge coin engraved with the emblem of the regional JAG office. He addressed the group. "Lieutenant Lawson has demonstrated exceptional professionalism in recent months. Her integrity, her attention to detail, and her dedication reflect the highest values of this service. She supported a complex investigation with clarity and courage. Her conduct set a standard for others." He then extended the coin toward me. "On behalf of this command, thank you for your quiet strength." The applause was warm, sincere, filling the courtyard with a gentle swell of appreciation. As I accepted the coin, its weight in my palm felt symbolic not of victory, but of reclamation. This was not recognition for surviving Richard or enduring Brielle. It was recognition for standing tall long after I left them behind. After the ceremony, several officers approached me with kind words. A captain mentioned how impressed he was by my composure. A warrant officer said my persistence reminded him of his own daughter. A civilian paralegal thanked me for making their case preparation smoother and less stressful. For the first time in my life, I was not background noise. I was not the invisible girl doing unpaid labor to keep a household from collapsing. I was not the scapegoat of someone else's insecurity. I was seen. And more importantly, I was seen for who I truly was. Later that evening, I walked alone along the Savannah riverfront, the challenge coin warm in my pocket from my hand turning it over repeatedly. The sky was streaked in pink and gold, and the water shimmered with the soft movements of the tide. I paused by the railing, leaning slightly as I stared at the horizon. It struck me then that victory does not always roar. Sometimes victory is quiet. Sometimes it looks like an empty apartment free of shouting. Sometimes it feels like the gentle weight of a coin meant to acknowledge what no one else ever knew you were carrying. Sometimes victory is simply the moment you realize you are no longer fighting ghosts. I took a slow breath, letting the coastal air fill my lungs. I was stronger now, not because of Richard, not because of Brielle, not because of survival. I was stronger because I had chosen to live a life they no longer had the power to shape. And in that quiet, standing by the river as dusk settled, I understood this was my victory. My quiet, undeniable victory. Tybee Island was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that feels earned rather than accidental. The tide rolled in gentle waves, brushing the shoreline with a steady rhythm that reminded me of breathing of release, of the simple fact that the world continues even when everything inside you has been torn apart and sewn back together again. I stood barefoot where the water met the sand, letting the ocean foam curl around my ankles. The breeze swept across the water and lifted strands of my hair, pulling them away from my face, as if the wind itself were insisting that nothing should obscure my view of what was ahead. I reached into my pocket and held the JAG challenge coin Reeves had given me, its metal surface warmed against my palm, a steady reminder of what I had survived and who I had become. The sun hung low over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber, and rose a soft glow stretching across the waves in a shimmering path that looked almost like a road toward somewhere better. I breathed deeply, tasting the salt in the air, feeling the edges of my past loosen their grip. There was a time when standing alone like this would have frightened me, a time when silence meant tension, not peace, a time when solitude meant danger, not safety. But here, on this open shoreline, I felt whole in a way I had never known growing up. I glanced down at my own reflection in the shallow water. The woman staring back at me no longer carried the posture of someone waiting for the next blow, verbal or emotional. My shoulders were steady, my jaw relaxed, my eyes clear. This was the first time I fully believed that the past did not define me unless I let it. Behind me, the beach stretched almost empty, a few distant silhouettes walking dogs or strolling lazily as the day softened into evening. No one was shouting. No one was demanding anything. No one was claiming that I did not deserve the life I had built. And maybe that was the most powerful change of all. I finally understood that I belonged to myself. I stepped closer to the water, letting the tide wash over my feet again. My voice was soft at first when I spoke, as if testing the space around me. "Family is not who you are born to," I said quietly. "Family is who never uses you as a tool." The words drifted into the wind, but something inside me anchored them, sealing them into truth. For years, Richard treated me like a resource to exploit, not a child to protect. Brielle treated me like a rival she needed to outperform or diminish. Even my mother, loving but trapped, often treated me like a buffer between her and chaos. But standing here now with the shoreline stretching endlessly in both directions, I realized that their version of family had never been mine. I had spent years trying to earn a place in a house that had no space for me. And yet the moment I stepped away from them, the world opened. My commission, my career, my peace, my strength. None of it depended on their approval. None of it would have existed if I had stayed under their roof, shrinking myself to fit their expectations. I closed my eyes and let the wind move around me, lifting the tension from my shoulders, piece by piece. Becoming an officer was not just a professional milestone. It was emancipation. It was the moment I severed the final strand of the rope that had tied me to a life built on fear. And so I spoke the truth with a clarity that felt like a declaration to the ocean, to the sky, to myself. The day I became an officer was the day I escaped them. Saying it aloud felt like unlocking a door inside my chest. The weight that had lived there since childhood finally slipped free, like a stone falling into deep, forgiving water. I imagined it sinking beneath the waves until it disappeared. I let the silence fill the space after my words, but this time the silence felt triumphant, not empty. I turned the challenge coin in my hand again, feeling the grooves in the metal. This coin was not proof of worthiness. It was proof of survival, proof of integrity, proof that I had stepped into a world where I was valued for who I was not, degraded for who I was not. It symbolized a victory that was not loud or dramatic, but steady, earned, and deeply personal. I slipped it back into my pocket and lifted my gaze toward the horizon. In the fading daylight, the ocean shimmered with endless possibilities. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was ready. I took one slow breath, grounding myself in the moment, then spoke the final words of my journey. Words meant not just for me, but for anyone who had ever stood where I once stood. Have you ever had to stand up to a toxic family and choose your own peace over their chaos? I turned slightly, imagining the thousands of people who might hear this story. If you have, you are not alone. And if you haven't yet, your moment will come. I stepped backward from the water, leaving behind footprints that the waves quickly erased. Then, with a voice clear and steady, I delivered the final call. Comment the city you are watching from. Your story might save someone tonight.